Did you know that I was once a suspect in a murder investigation? Yes, it's a true story. Without a word of a lie, I'm going to tell you it. So, why don't you sit back, relax, and have a listen to the story from the past, from the Macedon Ranger's voice, Big Daddy O. That's right, this character now has a name. He's been given a christening or something, a naming ceremony, a modern one. We don't care. Let's get back to the meat and potatoes. Speaking of murder, yes, I know, and I'm not making fun of murder or anything like that because it's a very serious issue and all that, but I just wanted to tell you my interactions with the homicide squad of the Victoria Police. And I don't want to denigrate them at all, but this is the story. It was many, many years ago. It was way back in 1997, when we still had a Princess Diana, although she wasn't currently in colloquy with the Prince. That doesn't matter now, but it comes in later on. I was staying at my dearly beloved's house because it was a Sunday. It was a pretty normal Sunday, and I think we were watching the 6 o'clock news because, well, that's the sort of thing you did when you had nothing else to do on a Sunday afternoon, and it was August in 1997. And I was listening to the news or watching it on some channel, don't know. On came a story breaking in Melbourne. 2 skulls had been found in the backyard of a Brunswick house. Now I was immediately piqued by this story. It grabbed me because, well, I lived in Brunswick. And the idea of 2 skulls, that was quite good to me because I was wondering what the hell was going on. As the story progressed, I came to realise that they were actually talking about my house. And they'd found 2 skulls in the backyard. So let's take this story back a little bit, because I really need to give a little bit more context to this whole share house situation. The thing is, I'd been there too long and I knew it. But I was still there, and I still hadn't quite made up my mind whether it was time to move on. In the last 7 years of living in that share house, it had kind of become a revolving door for EU backpackers. It was a strange thing which started with a single Dutch woman who came to study goldsmithing at RMIT. You know who you are, Medea. And she stayed for about a year and then brought all her friends out, which was fine because the house was just full of Dutch women, which, you know, could never be a bad thing. And they were all quite a lot of fun, and, you know, we had parties and played pranks and all that sort of stuff. Nice pranks. No one really got hurt, or there was no victims anyway. And then other people started arriving from other parts of Europe, and they all had a sort of an artistic bent. And Mireia, who lived there for quite some time, whose sort of code name or her nickname was the Dutch Witch. It was a term of endearment. I did try to explain to her the whole Dutch courage, Dutch carrots, Dutch ovens, and all the other silly things in Australia that we put Dutch in front of. And she'd never heard of any of those things, which is, well, just shows how silly we are. Anyway, she had a sort of artistic bent, and she decided she was going to paint a mural in her bedroom. Now that sort of didn't sound like a bad thing. It looked quite nice. It was a pretty nice landscape, a few trees and so on. Mountains, lakes and so on. It was good. It set in motion a kind of convention of drawing on the walls or writing on the walls. So fairly soon, all the house messages were recorded in pencil on the walls in the lounge room. next to the phone, because that's what you did in those days before mobile phones. And so if you wanted to find phone numbers, you just had to look on the wall, and they were everywhere. And, you know, I put mine up high. But it wasn't until this enormous girl from East Germany came and lived with us that she could reach my phone numbers, because she was 6'5", and I don't think at that stage I had ever met a 6'5" woman. She was enormous, and she came by, and I don't know how long she stayed for actually. She just, you know, came by, and she had her own little quirks. If you get my drift, you get by with a little help from your friends, and she was pretty good at that. She also was an artist, despite her father being a forester, which maybe is what made her an artist. And her parents were very worried about her, and I'm sure if they found out anything about her life at our share house, they'd probably be even more worried. Anyway, she decided that she would, whilst I was at work one day, paint this really awful looking hippie flower or sun. I don't know. It was a sunflower flower on the front of the house in plain daylight for all the world to see, in a sort of very undiscreet way of saying, this is some kind of hippie house. Well, the message was loud and clear. And so the day came when Coneman, who was one of my housemates, his real name was Cameron, and just sort of worked well to call him Coneman, and he decided that he would do some gardening for a Sunday afternoon activity. We were into that sort of thing. Growing stuff. It was great. Apparently, it was completely above board. That's what he told me. And he dug a hole. And he found a skull. Then he found another skull. And then he found a dagger. I wasn't part of the story then, because if I had been phoned and asked what to do, I probably would have said, oh cool, 2 skulls. Let's see if we can make something like a candle holder or something like that. I was pretty stupid in those days, and probably pretty stupid now too. But I didn't get asked that, because he did the right thing. Coneman, we salute you. He called the cops. And the cops rushed around there. Pretty quick, actually. And then the news got announced, and it was on the news by 6 o'clock. So I'm assuming he was actually digging around midday, and the whole thing just boiled over. And then I noticed that there were lots of missed calls on my phone that I had not answered because the phone was in another room. Anyway, they all came from the same number, which was the home phone number. My telephone rang, my ancient mobile phone that just, all it did was make calls. It's hard to believe, right? Anyway, it rang. I recognised the phone number because it was the phone number of that house, the house that I was living in Brunswick. So I got that phone call and I picked it up because I thought, oh, it'll be Coneman telling me about the skulls. How cool's that? No, it was the police. And they said, is this Paul? And I said, well, yes. And how long have you been living in the house? I said, 7 years. It was a very long time to sit in a Brunswick share house, I can tell you. Way too long. Try and limit that in the future. Just keep it down to 2 or 3 years. Make it sensible. But anyway, 7 years. They didn't think that was very funny. They moved straight on. Do you know anything about the skulls? Do you have any ideas? And I told them the truth. I said, no, I don't. We'd still like to speak to you, because I think they thought I was lying. And then I thought to myself, maybe I am lying. I don't remember anything about the skulls. My dearly Belle and I decided we would do the right thing. Well, she's sensible, so she was always going to do the right thing regardless. So we got into the car, in what we called the installation. It wasn't really much of a car. It was more an art installation on wheels. I can tell you that story another day. And we crossed town with some trepidation because we were listening to the radio, tuning in, latest news, ABC. 2 skulls found, blah, 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 it was all that thing. Investigation underway, etc., etc., etc. And sure enough, when I pulled into our street, I could see that something was immediately different. There were a lot more police than normal, and a lot more police tape than normal around my house. I'd never seen police tape around my house. I bet you haven't seen police tape around your house either. But I was quite surprised. It said, police line, do not cross, etc. So we parked the car discreetly down the road, because I didn't want to be indiscreet, did I? I just wanted to wander up, like a murderer would, or like a murderer wouldn't. I don't know. I didn't have a plan at that point. I also noticed that on one side of the police line, the outside, there are a bunch of reporters, the media. And I thought to myself, because I did know the truth of the whole story, even if I was sort of questioning it just for fun in my mind, oh, this is fun. And I also noticed that there was a helicopter flying overhead. But I was still a bit scared, because, imagine being framed for 2 skulls being found in your backyard. That would not be very good. So, we crossed the police line, and at that point the media realised that the prime suspect had in fact arrived at the scene, at the crime scene. And so they started yelling questions. What's going on? Do you know anything about the skulls? Can you tell us more? What is your name? Where did you come from? Why is your car parked so discreetly? I did not answer them. I just gave them a wave and said, talk soon. Because I'd already started to plan my story. But I knew I had to get something out of the way first. And that was to talk to the police. I went to the front door, and there was a policeman staying there, and they said, what are you doing? Sort of thing. Who are you? I said, I'm Paul. I'm the guy that lives here. The guy you're wanting to question. And they said, oh, okay, that's cool. Why don't you come and sit down? We've already questioned the rest of the housemates. And they obviously wanted to keep us separate. That's the kind of the routine. I'm sure everyone's heard of that. They don't want to sort of put you all together so you can corroborate a story and find out the truth about the skulls, or present some fictitious story that, allows me to get away with chopping heads off and burying them in the backyard. They ushered me into the front room, which wasn't my room actually. I think it was Coneman's. And I lived in the very back, in the bungalow, and Coneman was in the front. But his room seemed to be neater than mine, I suspect, so, because he was often entertaining young ladies, means you have to have a neat room, whereas I'd go away to stay with my dearly beloved, so I could just have a messy room. And they sat me down in the room, and they said something like, the inspector will be with us soon. And sure enough, in came the inspector. Now this is the fuzzy bit, because I was pretty sure, in retrospect, it was Simon Overland. That could be completely wrong. Suffice to say, it was a guy that looked like Simon Overland in plain clothes, because they were, the murder squad or whatever. So he sat me down while I was sitting down. They took my details. When were you born? Etc. They didn't take my fingerprints. They don't do that. Well, not for this sort of stuff anyway. And I quickly came to the conclusion that they realised that I was not actually a murder suspect. Which was a great relief, because I can tell you my heart was kind of pounding just in case they had sort of come up with some story. So we can just all relax now, but I did sort of relax at the moment. And he said something like, yes, what do you know about these skulls? And I just said, I know nothing. And I I'd never heard of them. And I didn't bury them there, surprisingly, because I knew nothing. I didn't tell him my plans to turn them into interior decoration. That would have just probably inflamed the situation. I just kind of left it on the level, you know. And when they said that, well, they said, but you've been here for 7 years. Why, you know, in that time, you never heard of anything about Scotland? No. I was kind of a quaint no. And they believed me, which I gave them credit for that, because a lot of people don't give the police much credit, but they do have to do some pretty damn awful things. And I suspect they knew how to deal with criminals, and they could take one look at me and say, this guy's more of a joke than a criminal, and not really capable. I did ask a friend who was a policeman only a few years later, how do you recognise a criminal? And he said, they smoke holiday cigarettes. I thought to myself, gee, I thought it'd be more scientific than that. But oh well. Unfortunately, I was not smoking holiday cigarettes, so that kind of got me in the clear. So there's there's a hot tip for you guys. But now you don't have brands like Holiday. I don't know what you're having now. You just got to buy khaki ones. They're sort of camouflaged. So there I was. And it was pretty much over down, and they sort of said, look, thank you very much for coming and all that sort of stuff. We are going to continue the investigation because we don't know the facts of the situation. And look, we will be in touch should there be any further developments. You know, that was the sort of a little bit of a niggle thing in my mind. Maybe they, you know, knew more than I did, and I knew absolutely nothing. So they probably did know more than I did. The police decided they would hang around and just keep an eye on the place. So there was one policeman who sat in the lounge room the whole night, which I thought was strange, considering he sort of had to push the bong out of the way. And he said, how about you guys just hide that, because we're not here for that. Maybe we'll be back next week. So, you know, we didn't tell it where I didn't hide it. Somebody else did. I didn't know what it was. It had nothing to do with me. So the policeman stayed there all night, which didn't really give us much freedom, but we did have some time. The flatmates and I got together and we talked about it, and we ran through the whole sequence of events. When we sat down to try and put the whole story together, and my friends in the house did actually ask me, Paul, do you really know anything about the skulls? Because we know you said you didn't to the police, but we want to know, really, do you know anything about the skulls? And I, again, confessed to them that no, I didn't know anything about the skulls until I got the phone call from the cops. I never actually saw the skulls, but I did get all the details from Cone Man. So they were brownish colour. They were a bit dirty because they were underground, but they were buried in a plastic bag with the dagger. I want to know more about the dagger. The dagger apparently was not a high quality dagger. It was more of a kind of a cheap Aussie disposals Chinese one, so it wasn't really something very exotic. And while we were trying to put the facts together, I then remembered that the previous tenants at the house were in fact members of a religious sect or group, I don't know really much about them, called the Ananda Marga. They're a fairly harmless, I don't know, subcategory of an Indian religion of some sort. They're not mainstream, I know that much. And they've had a presence in Australia for quite some time. And they're just like most religious things, you know. When you die, you go to heaven or you're reborn or whatever. You know, solves life's great problems with simple answers. And they were the previous tenants in the house. The house was incredibly spotless when we moved in. It wasn't by the time 7 years later and, you know, all that bong water and so on. One of the reasons that the house was so clean was because they never wore shoes inside the house. And they had no furniture. None. Cushions only. I don't know how that worked. I never saw it in action. But I think it was actually more used as a prayer centre than an actual house. That's my understanding. A place where they could do their things, whatever their things were. in the privacy of, the house. So when I realised that, I then had some inkling that they might have had something to do with it. It was at that point that I decided that there was fun to be had, but not at anyone's expense. Okay, so it wasn't a kind of stick to the man situation. But I knew that there was a pack of the media out the front. And I knew that they would be interested in talking to us. But we needed to be careful, because we just couldn't come out and put the water on the story. Snuff it out by just talking to the media and saying, we had nothing to do with it. It's nothing to do with me. It's all blah, blah, blah. So I decided that we would keep it a little bit on the QT and not talk to the media. Because with the helicopter flying overhead and us on live TV, it didn't make sense. Because this was a golden opportunity to send the media into a frenzy. It was the first time I'd ever had this opportunity. So when we left the house that night, I decided to stay at my dearly beloved's because, quite frankly, there was a cop there who had just found a bong. So as I left, I went through the front door, and as I crossed the police line with the tape, the media rushed. They rushed at me. What are you doing? Who are you? What's happening? Who's going on? How many bodies? I said, we haven't got anything to say at the moment. We've got nothing to say. And they took my word for it, and they left me alone, which was good. But they were hiding everywhere. They'd even found where my discreetly hidden car was. And they asked me a few more questions at that point, and I answered with the same answer, which was, it's not anything I can talk about at the moment. The investigation was ongoing. There's Simon Overland in there. He's asking the hard questions about the bong. No, I didn't mention that. That's a joke. So we went home. Next day's papers, there we were on the front page. Skull House, the deadly death murder cult in Brunswick. Now, I didn't have anything to do with that story. I did not create that illusion. But I sure as hell did amplify it from that moment on. Because that's when the media started calling me. And so I had to act a little bit dumb. Because, again, it was only day one. And front page day one is great. Front page day 3 is even better. So on it went. Nightly news, investigation underway. Every update had some more information delivered. Fairly soon the forensics had discovered that the skulls in fact belonged to 2 14-year-old-ish females. The origin of the skulls could probably be traced back to their use by medical students for anatomy lessons. And at some point in time in the middle of the week, I did in fact get a phone call from the homicide squad. And the nature of the phone call was, Paul, we know you're not involved, which was kind of, again, it wasn't really something I was worried about, but I did kind of hang over the head a bit. Bit of worry, Mum, Dad, what's going on, blah, blah, blah. We know they're not your skulls because the owners have come forward. Now, this was perfect timing for my interview with The Age. When the Amanda Marga came forward and said, can we have our skulls back? And yes, they do belong to us. I did ask the police if they were going to give the Amanda Marga the skulls back. Of course. I wanted to know where the skull's going to go. I actually thought we could do with them. But anyway, that wasn't going to happen. They weren't going to give them to the Ananda Marga, and they weren't going to give them to us to make into candle holders and or ashtrays. I mean, it's very undignified, the whole thing, right? You know, obviously I was much more silly in those days. We actually said that it was lucky that we found the skulls because we were level-headed people and reasonable people and did the right thing and called the cops. So then, by about Wednesday, I decided I would return one of the calls. I thought I would go with a credible publication because that way my story would have a little bit more credibility. Now, they'd already worked out that it wasn't the kids in the share house that were responsible for these skulls. And the murder cult, well, it just didn't exist. So we had to make some more facts around the story. And I knew about these skulls, in fact. Not these particular skulls, just to be clear. My friend had one, Barry Cooper. He had a skull. He bought it from an op shop. How bizarre was that? And it was a real skull. That was in the days when India used to export skulls and body parts as part of their, I don't know, do something with their natural resource, which is most abundant. People. They weren't murdering them. They were just people whose bodies were found and not claimed. They would sell them for science, and science meant selling them to other countries. They do not do this anymore. I believe that trade stopped in about 1960 something. It's fairly ghoulish. So I put those two stories together and spun a little bit of a web with my journalist friend at the Age. I then explained what I thought was the truth, or at least I thought he would swallow as the truth. And he did. And he explained in his article, which was published the next day, Thursday or Friday, I can't remember, the two skulls had originated as medical students' tools, shall we say. I don't know what they do with them. They look at them. They say that's the cerebellum, whatever. I don't know what that is either. Whatever, the cortex, the eye socket, and so on, because they were skulls. Yes, I got to relive the whole thing again. And more questions came in and more TV time. You know, it was quite good. By this stage, the truth was out. The Herald Sun had done their thing, calling us the Skull House and the Death Cult and all that sort of stuff. We made about 3 front pages at the time, but we were slowly moving back as they reported more and more of the less exciting facts, which was boring. But I thought, there's legs in this story still. Why give up? Why give up? So I contacted Countdown, which had a TV show on Sunday mornings for kids in share houses, one of their favourite sort of topics. And I thought, we could make a story out of this. And we did. So we invited the film crew down. The funny thing was, by this stage, the rest of my housemates were dead against any more media shenanigans. And they kind of hated me because I did try and milk the whole thing for what it was worth. Hate's probably a strong word, but, you know, they didn't think it was as funny as I did, and I was sort of having a laugh along the way. In fact, I was belly laughing constantly at the fun. And then there was the last day I had anything to do with the murder squad, or whatever it's called. Because the murder squad, or whatever they're called, came to our house, and whilst the helicopters were flying over and people were going through our personals and asking questions of flatmates that they had no idea what they were answering, they all just said no, which is good. I mean, the story could, you know, go on. They were excavating the backyard. They dug massive holes. Looking. The whole place looked like, you know, something from Gardening Australia where they say, prepare the soil well, you know, and there was all massive piles of everything, and it was just like, they just kept looking for bits. They never found anything, you know. They didn't even find my Swiss Army knife, which I'd lost. I was hoping that would happen, but it didn't happen. So I thought I'd give them a call to say, look, guys, is there any chance you guys were going to come and, clean up or whatever? I thought it'd be worth. I was just, maybe it was going to happen. Now, obviously, there was a little bit of a laugh in my voice because when I said something like, "Hello, this is Paul Hosking," and I obviously had some sort of, laugh, as I said, in my voice. And they said something like, "Oh, you're from Skull House." And I said, "How did you know?" And it was obvious that they recognised my name, because the policeman on the other end of the line answered like this: "Because nobody ever rings the murder squad while they're laughing." I took that as evidence that the Victoria Police are actually well trained and very intuitive. And no, they weren't going to come and clean up. And then a very sad thing happened. Princess Diana and her friend Dodie, Prince Dodie or something, were killed in a car accident along with their driver. This was the biggest news story of August and September. And that was the end of the Skull House story. There was no way they were going to print any frivolous articles about a murder plot, a murder house, a death cult, the Skull House, etc. With England's Rose dead, there were more important things to worry about. Although I haven't found it, and maybe I never will, somebody did make a cartoon joke, which I thought was in quite poor taste, even though it would be the sort of thing you'd think I would like, where they had two skulls, which was referring to the Skull House. And one was called Dodie, and one was called Diana. I don't know if it was Tanberg. I'm pretty sure it was. Anyway, that's the story of Cone Man and Big Daddy and the Skull House. Why don't you have a great day?